There are a lot of different factors which go towards making a great professional wrestler. On one hand, you have to be able to talk on the mic, and on the other hand, you must have that intangible star quality. Perhaps equally important to either of these, though, especially in the modern day, is the ability to go in the ring. After all, if you can't do the actual wrestling part of being a wrestler, then you're not going to last very long. But who are the best when it comes to this particular aspect of the craft? Who are the ones who can tell a story between the ropes without the need for words? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into the greatest of all time in Technical Wizards, wrestling's best in-ring performers. Of course, with a subject like this, there are 1,000 different options which could come from 1,000 different eras. So maybe the easiest place to start then is with the modern day. And for our money, no one does it better right now than Bryan Danielson. Yes, whether it be in Ring of Honor, WWE, or AEW, the American Dragon has built such an impressive body of work over the last 2 decades, he can legitimately hold a claim to not only being the best of his generation, but the best to ever do it. How has he achieved this? Well, by learning from his mentor William Regal and taking a very European style to the way he works, with much of his moveset being built on crisp catch-as-catch-can mat work. And in doing so, he's been able to make fans believe that, despite being a smaller guy, he can easily topple anyone he comes up against with either some well-placed strikes or one of his many brutal submissions, such as the cattle mutilation or the label lock, moves which he's executed to perfection throughout his classic ROH bouts against the likes of Kenta, Samoa Joe, and of course, Nigel McGuinness. That said, despite his world-beating skills, for the first few years of his career he'd be considered something of wrestling's best-kept secret. And that was because, largely making his name as the King of the Indies, Danielson would never get a chance to shine on TV. This would change when he signed with WWE in 2009, however, as there, suddenly, he had a worldwide audience to show off what he could do. And even if Vince McMahon didn't see much in him as a main event player then, the fans certainly did, with this leading to them eventually hijacking shows for almost a full year in 2013, demanding that the American Dragon take his rightful spot at the top of the card. After that, the Washington native would be a made man, enough to where he would become a 5-time world champion and a 2-time WrestleMania main eventer. But while both his everyman personality and his promo skills had helped to get him to this point, more than anything else it was his in-ring work and ability to tell a story between the ropes which wowed audiences so much he simply couldn't be ignored. Of course, since then he's gone on to join All Elite Wrestling, where working as a key member of the Blackpool Combat Club, he's helping to impart his skills onto a younger generation of folks like Wheeler Yuta and Daniel Garcia. And while he's doing this, back over in WWE, another contender for greatest in-ring wrestler of his generation is also winding down his career. Though, when it comes to AJ Styles, he was largely able to make his name in both TNA and New Japan before ever stepping inside of a Vince McMahon-owned ring. That's right, there was a period in the mid-2000s when total non-stop action wrestling was considered the main competition to WWE's then monopoly over the American wrestling industry. And throughout that time, there was one secret weapon the company had to set themselves apart from their rival, with this being the phenomenal one himself. Basically, if Bryan Danielson is the modern-day Bret Hart, then AJ is the second coming of Shawn Michaels, someone who has unparalleled high-flying skills and has used this to put on some of the best matches of his era. Of course, in TNA, this meant having some stone-cold classics against the likes of Samoa Joe and Christopher Daniels as, being a key part of the X Division, he would regularly steal the show every week. Then, once he moved up to the main event division, he'd put on equally as great showings against more established stars like Kurt Angle and Christian Cage, proving here that he had what it took to not only hang with the best of them, but even exceed them at points. But while all this gave Styles a reputation of being one of the most consistently underrated wrestlers in the business, things would go to another level altogether when, in 2014, he made the jump over to New Japan Pro Wrestling and became the second leader of the Bullet Club. And that's because it was well out east that he morphed into his final form, a superstar who was good enough to hold the IWGP Heavyweight title on 2 separate occasions and have classics against the likes of other contenders for GOAT in-ring worker Kazuchika Okada and Kota Ibushi. Then once his time out east was done, he'd finally move over to WWE, where despite initially being pegged for a mid-card role, he'd wow Vince McMahon so much that the boss would have no choice but to make him a 2-time WWE champion by the point his first contract had ended. That said, For as quickly as he was able to reach the top in New York, even he wasn't as fast of a riser as our next entry. And that's because when Kurt Angle took to the ring for the first time in 1999, it was as if he'd been doing it for years. Sure, prior to this, Angle had won an Olympic gold medal in amateur wrestling, but the theatrics of the pros have always been an entirely different beast, with many not being able to successfully make the shift between the two. When it came to the Olympic hero, however, he'd have no such problems as, after only a few months on the roster, he'd already be going toe-to-toe with other all-time greats like Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho. In fact, so good was he at incorporating his amateur skills into a pro wrestling context, he'd arguably have exceeded his peers by this early point. And that was partially why, in October of 2000, after less than a year on TV, Kurt would dethrone The Rock to become the WWF champion for the first time. From there, then, he would be a made man as every match he had seemed to be better than the last. In fact, if you were to list all the 5-star classics he had during this period, it would be a video all in itself, so in the interest of brevity, we'll just name a few here. Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Brock Lesnar, Shawn Michaels. Really, we could go on all week with this, but at the end of the day, the point remains the same: the Olympic hero may very well be the best to ever do it. And this was something he would continue to prove when he moved over to the second half of his career and started working with TNA in 2006, with him there getting to have even more great bouts against the likes of Samoa Joe and AJ Styles. That said, if we're including Angle on this list of all-time greats, then we really have to include one of his peers we briefly mentioned earlier too, because while Kurt was undoubtedly great, some would argue that Eddie Guerrero was even better. What made Eddie so special wasn't his mat work though. Sure, he could do this, but where he really excelled was his lucha-inspired high-flying offense. And this was something he'd picked up from his family as it happened because, being a member of the legendary Guerrero family, Eddie was considered something of Mexican wrestling royalty. But even with this heavy weight of expectation on his shoulders, he still managed to exceed the rest of his kin before long as, after signing with World Championship Wrestling in 1995, he'd suddenly find himself on a worldwide stage for the first time. And using this experience to his advantage then, he'd become an instant star when he was able to put on some 5-star classics against the likes of Rey Mysterio, Chris Benoit, and Chris Jericho. Of course, at the time, WCW management were slow to realize what they had on their hands with the Texas native, and so, instead choosing to bet on himself rather than get lost in mid-card purgatory, Eddie would jump over to WWF in January of 2000 and there find a whole new cast of characters to work with. That said, this period would also mark the end of his run, as with his drug issues reaching a critical point by now, even his once-in-a-generation lucha skills would not be enough to see him through. Luckily though, by the mid-2000s he had cleaned himself up, and so, when he got the chance to challenge Brock Lesnar for the WWE title in February of 2004, he'd be able to put on one of the single greatest matches in company history, as over the course of almost 30 minutes, he made everyone gradually believe he could topple the Beast. And when he finally did so then to win the world title for himself, the fans' reaction was monstrous as an all-time great feel-good moment was created. But this was far from the only great feel-good moment WWF had made by that point because, almost a decade prior to this, Vince McMahon had made a boyhood dream come true when he booked Shawn Michaels to win that same belt at WrestleMania 12. Why had he done so? Well, to put it simply, despite being notoriously impossible to work with behind the scenes on account of his attitude, HBK was just so good in the ring that no one could deny him the top prize. Yes, after moving away from team action in the early 90s and turning his eye towards singles competition, Shawn had proven himself to be unparalleled in the ring with his numerous show-stealing performances. Amongst these, of course, were his groundbreaking ladder matches with Razor Ramon, as well as his multiple showdowns with Diesel. And it would only get better when he won the title from Bret Hart as it happened because, after putting on a 1-hour-long clinic with the Hitman, HBK would spend the rest of the 90s having more 5-star classics such as his Mind Games match with Mankind and his Hell in a Cell bout with The Undertaker. So that was why, when he was forced into early retirement in 1998 then, it felt very much like fans had been robbed of something special. Luckily though, he would eventually be able to return to the ring, and on this second run, he'd arguably be better than he was before. That's right, it would be this period which saw Michaels go toe-to-toe with folks like Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, John Cena, and once again, The Undertaker, with the latter putting on a bout at WrestleMania 25 which was so good, many people to this day still consider it to be the greatest of all time. But what of the yin to Shawn's yang, the man who could equally hold a case for being the greatest in-ring wrestler ever? Well, while he may have never gotten to have that second lengthy run, Bret Hart's work during the 90s was so good anyway that for a large number of people, no one has ever been able to do it any better to this day. And one look at his resume is enough to tell you why this is, because once the bell rang, there was no one in WWF during this decade who could be relied upon more to have an excellent match that could get anyone invested in the story he was telling. Need evidence of this? Just look at his pair of showings with his brother Owen throughout 1994, either of which could easily stand tall as the best bout of their era. And if that's not enough, what about his SummerSlam 1992 Classic against the British Bulldog, or his WrestleMania 13 I Quit match with Steve Austin, the latter of which was a brutal and bloody war that was so good we would probably still rank it as the best we've ever seen. That said, it wasn't all about making himself look good, because with his crispness on the mat and his unparalleled ring IQ, the Hitman was able to elevate everyone around him, so much so that he could take a far lesser worker and make them look like a true superstar. In fact, this is exactly what happened with rookie Tom McGee in 1986, as during a tryout bout he got to have against the Hitman at this point, Hart would make him appear so special that Vince McMahon initially thought he'd found his next Hulk Hogan in the former powerlifter. Of course, the irony of this was that he actually did have his next top guy right there in the ring that night, even if he didn't realize it at the time. And in the years which followed, Bret would prove this each and every time he went through the curtain, to the point that he became a 5-time world champion, a 2-time Hall of Famer, and a bona fide Canadian legend. But even if he is the most successful figure to come out of the famed Hart family dungeon, there's one other who many consider to be an even better in-ring wrestler than him. Who is this? Why, none other than the Dynamite Kid. Now, when we're talking about Tom Billington's case as the greatest technical wrestler of all time, it's important not to understate his influence, as pretty much all of modern high-flying wrestling can be traced back to him. Yes, back in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of acrobatic movement going on in the ring, and that's exactly why, when he first broke out during this decade, it changed the game forever. Sure, he could do the mat work aspect just as well as Bret or any of his other peers could, but what separated the Lancashire native from the rest was that he was able to go off his feet and create something which fans had never seen before, something which was a lot more high risk and spectacular in its nature. In fact, if you're looking for a single bout which pretty much gave birth to the modern style you'd see from the likes of Kenny Omega or Will Ospreay today, you only have to take a look at Dynamite Kid's now legendary showing against Tiger Mask in December of 1983, as here, the blueprint for a whole new way of doing things would be laid out in full. And once he had people's attention with this then, Billington would move over to WWF where, alongside his tag team partner Davey Boy Smith, he'd become one of the star acts of that company's tag team division during a period where it was arguably at its most stacked. Unfortunately though, by this point, the innovative high-risk style he had helped to create was starting to take its toll on the Englishman's body, and so, by the time it got to the early 90s, he'd pretty much have to retire from in-ring competition altogether, as he could barely even stand up on his own power. That said, even if it was a relatively short career, the changes he made to the industry thereafter have to earn him a spot in this list, because without Tom Billington and his work in creating modern wrestling as we know it, we would probably never have gotten so many of the people we consider among the best today. But while he may have been the first, he wasn't the only person in the 80s who was making a name for himself as a wrestler with a spectacular acrobatic style. No, in fact, some were able to take the groundwork he laid here and ride it all the way to the top, because with the help of his amazing technical skills, Randy Savage would have become a 2-time WWF champion by the time his in-ring career was done. Yes, the Macho Man, one of the most iconic performers of all time, and still to this day a pop culture icon. And sure, while a lot of this was because of his wild look and his intense coke-filled promo style, equally as important was the fact that, in a period where in-ring work had never been prized less over in New York, Savage was able to prove that being a great wrestler still meant something to the fans. How did he do this? Well, by simply being one of the greatest ever to lace up a pair of boots, a moniker he earned by having classic match after classic match against the likes of Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and even the Ultimate Warrior. So good was he, in fact, that despite playing the heel early on in his career, he'd be one of the most popular babyfaces in the industry before long, and would also become one of the rare faces who got to hold the WWF World title outside of Hulk Hogan during the 80s. And it wouldn't just be once that he held this belt. No, he'd hold it on 2 separate occasions, making him the only man to even come close to eclipsing the Hulkster during this time. Of course, part of the reason he was able to do this was because of his meticulous and single-minded dedication when it came to being the best. And this meant spending each and every waking minute thinking of new ways to not only sculpt his body into a wrestler's physique, but also stand out from the crowd with his often lavish ring gear. Then, once it came time to step in between the ropes, Savage knew exactly where he was going because, prior to this, he'd always plan out his matches move for move ahead of time. And while this may have frustrated some of his co-workers at the time, it's hard to argue with the results, as using this very method, he was able to give us one of the greatest WWE bouts of all time when he stole the show from Hogan and Andre at WrestleMania 3. But what of his opponent during that match? Surely he holds a claim to being the best too, right? Absolutely. And that's why our next subject is none other than Ricky Steamboat. That's right, Ricky Steamboat potentially has an even stronger case than Randy for being the GOAT in-ring worker, because not only was he able to put on that show-stealing classic with him at WrestleMania 3, but he was also able to put on a number of bouts which were equally as good while working in both the Territory System and later WCW. In fact, during this period he becomes so highly regarded for his technical prowess that the Dragon became something of a byword for quality, particularly when it was in reference to his deep arm drags or his high-flying offense. And this would arguably reach its peak during a trilogy which many to this day still consider to be the greatest ever, the Flair Steamboat trilogy. But why is this one considered so special? Well, across 3 bouts, a single epic story was told of Ricky going for the NWA World's title, winning it, and then losing it back again in heartbreaking fashion. And what made these even more impressive was that there was no planning it out ahead of time move for move. No, it was all improvised on the fly. Of course, these bouts alone would be enough to put anyone in consideration for the top in-ring wrestlers ever, but Steamboat's legacy doesn't end there, because we could push all the way back to the 70s if we want to find early classics of his. And even in 2009, at the age of 56, he was still able to show the youngsters around him how it was done when he damn near stole the show again at going up against Chris Jericho at WrestleMania 25. That said, our next entry is arguably the biggest of all, because if we're talking about the greatest in-ring workers to ever do it, there's no way we could ever go without mentioning Ric Flair. Yes, we've alluded to him a few times already, as he's usually a common denominator in other people's top matches, but that's only to be expected when you're the Nature Boy, because for the last 5 decades, he's become synonymous with greatness. You only have to look at the fact that he's won at least 16 world titles over the course of his career and was, throughout the 80s, the poster boy for the National Wrestling Alliance if you want any evidence of this. And we could spend all day listing the great matches he's had against the likes of Harley Race, Terry Funk, Ricky Steamboat, Randy Savage, Sting, Dusty Rhodes, and countless others too, but we only have 20 minutes here, so let's just shorten things down by saying that if you were to poll 100 wrestlers as to who the GOAT was, there's a pretty good chance the majority of them would say it was Ric Flair. Hell, even in the later period of his career when he rejoined WWE in the 2000s, he was still able to put on a classic, as could be evidenced in the great showings he had against the likes of Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, and Randy Orton. And when it came time to finally hang up his boots in 2008, Nate would do this by stealing the show one final time when he had one of the best matches of his career against Shawn Michaels. Of course, since then he has made a number of returns to the ring, each to less impressive effect than the last. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that, during his heyday and beyond, there were few, if any, who were better than Slick Rick. In fact, you could argue that the only people who can compete with him are those on today's list, as whether it be through acrobatic lucha stylings, crisp mat work, perfect psychology, or just breaking new ground for everyone, each can hold a claim to being the best in-ring wrestler ever.